If you own property in New York City, if you rent in New York City, if you work in New York City, this upcoming mayor election is about your money. We're talking about rent freezes. We're talking about property tax hikes as well as income tax hikes. Also, don't forget minimum wage increases as well. Okay. This will determine whether or not you're able to afford living in New York City after January. So let's get into it. I'm going to show you three scenarios. One is a rent free scenario, the other is a property tax hike scenario. And lastly, we're going to talk about minimum wage increase scenario and put all of those together. Okay. Rent freezes. So here, what we're looking at is essentially a bar graph that I put together under the hypothetical scenario of, let's say, a 6-unit Manhattan building, okay, where the rent is frozen, okay? The rent is locked in at $552,168. Just came up with that number between, I would say, about $7,000 to $8,000 per unit, and that's per year, okay? Now, the annual operating cost is starting at about $404,173. I'm going to put a modest growth of about somewhere between 4 and 6%. So let's say 5% every year. Now, that's going to include costs like maintenance and repairs, property management of about a modest about maybe 7-8%, reserves for renovations, mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, and solid waste disposal. Hope I didn't miss anything, but that's pretty much where I figure the cost may lie. And again, that total cost for a 6-unit building could be about, say, $404,000. And we're going to increase that by 5% per year. Well, in year one, you're pretty much seeing a net operating income that's pretty healthy, about $147,995. Okay. But look at what happens at about year 5. At year 5, we have dropped by more than 50% down to $60,893 for net operating income. By year 7, you are at a very dismal, just over $10,000 net operating income. And then year 8, you just essentially flip. You're now under 16, almost 17,000, and by year 10, you have a net operating income of about $75,000. So people hear rent freeze and think, great, stability. And here's what it actually looks like if you own a small 6-unit walk up in Manhattan. And this is also the reason why mom and pop landlords essentially stop fixing boilers, they stop repairing roofs, or just walk away. Unfortunately, we've seen that happen before back in the 1970s and even into the 80s. The math dies before the building does, unfortunately. But that's essentially what happens in cases like this. So now let's look at what happened if we now start applying tax hikes, okay? So now you have a net operating income that is projecting the impact of higher tax burden plus a rent freeze. And I'm looking at a nominal maybe 3, maybe 4% tax raise annually. Okay. So I'm not really going crazy on a tax raise. I don't think so. But if I'm wrong about that, I definitely would like to hear your comments on that. But look at the top line here. The orange line is the net operating income, which is your normal tax path, right? And remember, we're talking about an increase in tax burden along with a rent freeze. And so in this scenario, essentially the property owner is already losing money by around year 5. Okay. And the orange is essentially your normal world. Rents are inching up about 2%, taxes are creeping up about 3%, expenses are rising because everything's more expensive. You're not getting rich, but you can still service debt and keep the roof from caving in. The line here, this is Mom Donnie's world, right? Rents are politically frozen because tenants are hurting. Meanwhile, property taxes and compliance costs go up faster because we're going to make wealthy owners pay their fair share. And that's literally his pitch. And now you see what happens. By year 3, over here, what you're seeing is the NOI, net operating income, is already negative. By year 5, you're almost 80 grand underwater on a small mixed use 6 unit type building. And that's not an investing environment. That is a distress environment. And that's when buildings, unfortunately, begin to rot. Just when you thought it was over with just the rent freeze and tax hikes, well, now you have the minimum wage, right? And here we see an article by the Economic Policy Institute. You see here, it says a $30 by 2030 minimum wage increase in New York City is a bold proposal. Okay, and this is essentially what is being proposed here by the most likely winner candidate, Zoran Mamdani, who basically said, hey, by $30 by 2030 is what's needed. And look, I'll be honest with you, in a way, right, it does make sense in the sense that $16.50 an hour, you can't really live off of that, right? But that is supposed to be your minimum wage. That is supposed to be just at the bottom. The wages typically grow as the value of your skill set increases, right? So, I mean, if you're looking at an individual who is, say, working at Burger King's or McDonald's or what have you, you expect that person who has a lower skill labor is going to get paid lower than, say, a doctor, or even, let's just say, a building superintendent, right? Who, went to school, got all his courses, got certified for different things like fixing boilers and other building components. And that person is going to receive a higher pay. So, but in this case, we're looking at a minimum wage by 2030 at $30. And so that's a big deal over here. And so how is that going to affect things? Just looking at what the NOI, net operating income, is going to look like in this scenario with a wage increase, that orange again is your wage trajectory at about a 3% cost growth. That blue is working in that $30 minimum wage over time. And you can see where NOI is going to end up very quickly. Okay. Now, how does all this look when you put everything together? So we got these three scenarios. In the orange, okay, is your net operating income. When we're just talking about a rent freeze, okay, and we went through that. And then in the blue is both your rent freeze and your tax hike, okay? And you can see those numbers going below profitability fairly quickly, but over a certain period of time. But then look at the green. The green is all three of these scenarios together, right? That's your rent freeze, that's your tax hike, and that's your $30 minimum wage over time. Of course, remember, this is not just $30 minimum wage overnight, right? This is just something that's going to be phased in over time. But look at net operating income and how fast it just drops below profitability. We're talking about not even year 3, right? Just a little bit past year 2. You're already at break even, and now you're dropping way below real fast. Okay. So obviously it means that this mayor election, like I said, is a big deal. Depending on who wins, policies are going to be set, and elections have consequences. And if you have someone who's coming in saying that they are going to freeze rent, which, by the way, is very popular in New York City. A recent poll came out saying that 83% of New York City residents are in fact in favor of rent freezes. And not only that, from that number, I think it was something like 60% of Republicans are actually also in favor of rent freezes. Again, I completely understand it. I used to be a New York City resident myself. I understand that things can be very expensive, but there are consequences to these things, okay? When an investor is investing in a property, they're looking at future potential income. And if they know that there's going to be a rent freeze, then they know that there's going to be, to some extent, a minimum to which they can either get rental income or increase that rental income at very minimum, right? But guess what doesn't freeze? Guess what never stops? And that is the cost, right? The cost of goods and services, the cost of materials, the cost of labor, especially in this case, because now we're talking about rent freeze, and along with that, minimum wage increases up to $30 an hour. Now you're increasing personnel costs, right? And you're not even talking about the cost of materials to fix these properties. So over time, you can have a situation like what happened back in the 70s and 80s, where a lot of these buildings just kind of gotten abandoned over time. If you can only rent out units but for so much, but the cost of everything else just keeps going up, then what happens? A lot of that just get neglected to some extent. Again, I don't know the full details of how all this is going to work. And of course, one of the things that Andrew Cuomo used to always say is, people campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose, right? So you never get the full picture of what any of these candidates wants to do, right? They only tell you essentially what they are planning to do in some sort of vague sense. Whether it's I'm going to cut taxes, right? Or I'm going to raise taxes, or I'm going to, freeze the rent. So I'm going to increase housing supply. But it's almost impossible to get the entire picture because, number one, in so many ways, these candidates don't really ever want to just reveal everything so that their opponents can just, pick at either one of these three candidates. I don't blame them. So we don't know the full picture and the full details of how this works. I will say that there are other cities that you can look at for case studies, okay? There are other cities that have rent freezes and property hikes and minimum wage raises, which are a little higher than normal. Typically, those cities don't fare well, all right? Compared to other cities that lower taxes, allow for more housing supply to be built, and don't put any restraint on the landlords to rent their units at market rate. And what typically happens in those cases is that you have a better local economy in those cases because more investors are willing to pour more capital in those cities. If you got something out of this, I'd appreciate that you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and also share with your friends and neighbors. I really appreciate that. Thank you for joining RVM again, and I will see you in the next video.